The room was tense, the air thick with disapproval. Frank, a middle-aged man with a stern face, slammed his fist on the table. "And just why don't you like it, Frank?" someone asked, trying to keep the peace. Frank's eyes blazed with indignation. "It fosters almost totally negative and destructive reactions in young people. It smells phony and false. It is sung, played, and written for the most part by cretinous goons, with its almost imbecilic reiterations and sly, lewd, in plain fact, dirty lyrics. It manages to be the martial music of every side-burned delinquent on the face of the earth." The music he was referring to was rock and roll, the rebellious genre that had taken the nation by storm. And no one embodied this new sound more than Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll. Elvis had just finished a series of concert dates in the Midwest and Canada. He had given up on his gold lame suit, but not before a photograph was taken, which became the cover of his second collection of million sellers. 50 Million Elvis Fans Can't Be Wrong, released in February 1960. The image was so iconic that years later, John Bon Jovi would copy it for his own collection. 100 Million Bon Jovi Fans Can't Be Wrong. But was he joking, or was he serious? While Elvis was causing a stir with his music, another figure was making waves in a very different way. Billy Graham, the charismatic evangelist, was conducting a 16-week crusade at Madison Square Garden, known as the 100-Day Crusade. Comedian Lenny Bruce quipped, if he really wanted a challenge, he'd go to Vegas. During the crusade, George Beverly Shee performed a Swedish hymn, How Great Thou Art, which became a highlight for many. Billy Graham often featured popular singers in his crusades, including Pat Boone in the US and Cliff Richard in the UK. Pat Boone, with his clean-cut image, had a No. 21 album on the US charts with Hymns We Love, released at the same time as Elvis' Christmas album. He even had a No. 4 single with the spiritual A Wonderful Time Up There in 1958. To mark his retirement in 2005, Boone wrote and recorded Thank You Billy Graham, featuring Kenny Rogers and LeAnn Rimes. Bono, the lead singer of U2, once described Billy Graham as the voice of sanity. Despite the opposition, Elvis shows outside the US were just as wild. In Canada, the fan mania was intense. In Ottawa, Catholic ministers urged parents to keep their children away from Elvis performances. As a result, only 3,500 people showed up for the early show, but the second show was a capacity audience of 8,500. During a radio interview, Elvis revealed that he owned 8 cars, including 4 Cadillacs, a Lincoln, and 3 sports cars. His garage was already too small, but he didn't seem to mind. He even made a comment that could have been his own version of the Lennon Jesus moment. I'm not perfect. There was only one perfect man, and that was Jesus Christ. The people didn't like him, you know. They killed him, and he couldn't understand why. If everybody liked the same thing, we'd all be driving the same car and be married to the same woman, and it wouldn't work out. Elvis' next big project was the film Jailhouse Rock, directed by Richard Thorpe. The recording sessions for the songs were tense at first. Elvis, as usual, warmed up by singing gospel songs with the Jordanaires. An MGM representative told him to get on with it, and Elvis walked out of the studio, not to be seen for the rest of the day. After an apology from MGM, Elvis returned and worked meticulously on the songs. The outtakes from these sessions revealed just how much effort he put into getting the songs right. Elvis was briefly hospitalized when he swallowed a cap from his teeth during the filming. Despite this, he continued to work hard. Jim Denny from the Grand Ole Opry visited him on set and said, "I always believed in you." Elvis' response was bitter. "Does that son of a bitch think I've forgotten that he broke my heart?" On July 8th, Elvis met aspiring actress Anita Wood, but they avoided the opening of Loving You at the Strand Theater in Memphis. Instead, they went to a special midnight screening with Elvis' parents, Vernon and Gladys. The romance made the press, and there was talk of Anita becoming Anita Presley. At the same time, Elvis was dating other girls, and one had to climb out of a bedroom window at Graceland when Anita returned early. Loving You was a huge success, both in color and vista vision. The film told the story of a truck driver turned star, Deke Rivers, played by Elvis. Deke joins a roadshow run by Tex Warner and his ex-wife, Glenda Markle, who see him as their ticket to success. Deke's journey from hayseed to star is filled with controversy and manipulation. He eventually realizes how he is being used and walks out of a national TV show, but is wooed back. The film's songs, including Loving You and Got a Lot o' Livin' to Do, were performed by Elvis and the Jordanaires, with cameo appearances by Scotty, Bill, and D.J. Gladys Presley can be seen in the audience for Got a Lot o' Livin' to Do, wearing a blue dress and sitting behind a woman with her feet in the aisle. Elvis' first screen kiss was with the fan Daisy Bricker backstage in Amarillo. By the time of the premiere, Elvis had a hit single from the film, the double-sided Teddy Bear and Loving You. Teddy Bear knocked Love Letters in the Sand off the one spot and stayed there for 7 weeks. Elvis' success was not without competition. Ricky Nelson, the teen heartthrob from The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, was making waves with his smooth voice and charming presence. James Burton, Nelson's guitarist, influenced a generation of young guitarists, including Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones. The Jordanaires, who often worked with Elvis, also moonlighted with Ricky Nelson, much to Elvis' displeasure. Charlie Gracie's hit, Fabulous, on Cameo Records, was the kind of record Elvis never made. Charlie, who was told to sing like Elvis, had a unique style and a strong following. In August 1957, Elvis toured the Northwest, giving his longest show to date at the Memorial Stadium in Spokane, Washington, and playing to 26,000 people at the Empire Stadium in Vancouver, his largest audience yet. Elvis had invented arena rock, and he loved the screaming crowds because they covered up his mistakes. In Vancouver, Red Robinson, a Canadian disc jockey who had met many music legends, was the compere for Elvis. He found Elvis down to earth and without conceit, despite his fame. Before the show, Elvis drove around the stadium in a black Cadillac, waving to the crowd. The performance was intense, and the audience was out of control, forcing the show to stop. The same thing happened with the Beatles in 1964. After all the chaos, Elvis and his musicians needed a pick-me-up. What better way than to record a Christmas album in September? Steve Scholes, the producer, even supplied a Christmas tree and gifts. The sessions were a welcome break from the mayhem, and a reminder of the simpler joys in life. Elvis Presley's decision to join the Army was a big moment in his life, and it wasn't just about following orders. Elvis had become a huge star, and many people thought he could have avoided the draft. But Colonel Parker, Elvis's manager, had a different plan. He believed that serving in the Army would actually help Elvis's career in the long run. Elvis received his draft notice in December 1957, just a few weeks before Christmas. The notice said he had to report to the induction center in Memphis on January 20th. This was a problem because Elvis was supposed to start filming a new movie, King Creole, in New Orleans at the same time. Colonel Parker stepped in and managed to get Elvis a deferment until March, so he could finish the movie. When Elvis finally joined the Army in March 1958, it was a big deal. The press was all over it, and fans were worried about what would happen to his career. But Elvis went through the same process as any other new recruit. He had to get a physical, have his head shaved, and put on the standard Army uniform. He even got his own dog tag, which had his name and a number, 53,310,761. Elvis's time in the Army wasn't just about following orders. He was still Elvis Presley, and he brought his own style to everything he did. For example, he didn't just wear the standard Army clothes, he customized them. He added patches and made sure his uniform fit just right. He also kept in touch with his fans and even sent them letters and pictures from his time in the Army. While in the Army, Elvis was stationed in Germany. He lived in a nice house off base with his mom and dad, who joined him there. He still had his Cadillacs and even brought his dogs. He continued to write songs and even recorded a few while he was in Germany. He also made friends with his fellow soldiers and tried to be a good soldier. Elvis's time in the Army showed that he was willing to do his part for his country, even though he was a famous star. It also helped to improve his image. Before the Army, some people saw him as a rebellious troublemaker. After the Army, he was seen as a patriotic and responsible young man. This change in perception was exactly what Colonel Parker had hoped for. When Elvis returned from the Army in 1960, his career took off again. He made more movies and released more music. The army experience had given him a new maturity, and he was ready to take on the next phase of his life. Until the late 1940s, only men had to join the military through conscription. But Israel and then China started including women too. However, China found that making everyone join the military was very expensive. Having a large army is important, but a small volunteer army can be better. Soldiers who choose to join are usually more enthusiastic and disciplined. They stay longer, unlike short-term conscripts who come and go. The top officers and trainers are usually professional soldiers who can better prepare the new recruits. There have been problems with bullying in the military, and senior officers are supposed to stop it. Shows like The Army Game from the 1950s made light of these issues, but such a show wouldn't be allowed today. Many soldiers left the military with mental scars from abuse by cruel officers. On the other hand, shows like The Phil Silvers Show in the U.S. showed the Army as incompetent, with smart enlisted men like Sergeant Bilko outsmarting the officers. The Soviet Union might have seen this as a real documentary, but they never allowed similar shows about their own military. Propaganda was a big part of the Soviet strategy, and they wouldn't want to show any weaknesses. Conscription has some social benefits. It can make people healthier, teach them new skills, and give them discipline. But some argue that it's better to learn a trade as a civilian, so you don't risk your life. The military doesn't encourage independent thinking. It tells you what to do. During the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, both the Union and the Confederates used conscription. Many people thought conscription was like slavery. After the war, the U.S. only fought small wars, like the Spanish-American War, and conflicts with Native Americans. Conscription wasn't used again until World War I. After World War I, Germany was only allowed a small army, but Hitler ignored this by making military training compulsory for young men. This allowed him to build a large army and start World War II. The U.S. was worried when Germany took over France and started conscription again in 1940. Even college students supported it, despite being more likely to serve. Under the Selective Training and Service Act, all men between 18 and 45 had to register, and those chosen would serve for the war plus 6 months. Major Lewis Hershey managed this process until 1969. Some famous people, like Frank Sinatra and Dick Haymes, avoided service. Sinatra claimed a hearing problem and a fear of crowds, while Haymes was born in Argentina. Many people thought Sinatra was being dishonest, and Haymes' career never recovered. By 1945, warfare was changing. The U.S. dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan to end the war, killing around 200,000 civilians. This led to debates about whether it was the right decision. After the war, people hoped for lasting peace, and the U.S. stopped conscription, while the UK continued it. But tensions rose again with the Soviet Union. The Soviets controlled Eastern Europe and wanted to spread communism. Both the U.S. and Britain were concerned about this and feared Soviet propaganda. The Cold War began, a term coined by George Orwell in 1945. It was a period of tension and competition, but not direct fighting. NATO was formed to protect Europe from Soviet advances. President Eisenhower proposed a nuclear test ban, but Russia, having just tested its own bomb, wasn't interested. Korea was divided after World War II, with the North under Soviet control and the South under American influence. In 1950, North Korea, backed by the Soviets, invaded South Korea. The U.S. and other UN countries sent troops, including conscripts. The war was called a police action, to avoid calling it a war. General MacArthur pushed forward, and China put 1 million troops on alert. The death of Stalin in 1953 eased tensions, and an armistice was signed in 1953. Nikita Khrushchev became the new Soviet leader and denounced Stalin. He wanted the Soviet Union to be a major world power, and was upset when they couldn't match America's military might. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space, a victory for the Soviets. In 1960, the Soviet Union and China had a falling out, which was a benefit for the West. Eisenhower invited Khrushchev to the U.S., but the visit was poorly timed. Khrushchev visited a movie set and later criticized American culture, though he seemed to enjoy it at the time. He thought America would eventually collapse under its own excesses, but many Soviets were envious of American culture, especially music. Radio stations like Radio Luxembourg and the BBC World Service brought American music to the Soviet Union, and people secretly listened to artists like Elvis Presley. This music represented freedom to them, even though it was banned. In the late 1950s, Hungary had a major uprising against Soviet control. Soviet tanks crushed the rebellion, killing over 2,500 people. Elvis Presley supported the uprising and performed a benefit concert, a rare move for him. Being a celebrity didn't protect you from conscription. Baseball stars and musicians were called up, and some groups had changing lineups because of it. Major Hershey argued for keeping conscription, saying it was necessary for national defense. Elvis Presley was drafted in 1958, and his manager, Colonel Parker, saw it as a PR opportunity. Parker knew Elvis was a good, clean-living American boy who wouldn't cause trouble. If the U.S. had been at war, Parker might have felt differently, but he was confident Elvis would return safely. Elvis was posted to Germany, which wasn't ideal for Parker. Germany was divided into zones controlled by different countries, and tensions were high. The Berlin Wall was built to stop East Germans from fleeing to the West. Elvis was declared an enemy by the East German government, and the situation was tense. Other musicians like Eddie Fisher and Buddy Knox made records while in the military. The Everly brothers joined the Marine Corps and were allowed to serve together, which was unusual. The Four Preps and the Barren Knights made songs about conscription, some mocking it and others supporting it. In the UK, conscription continued until the 1960s. Every fit man between 18 and 26 had to serve for 2 years, and then 4 years in the reserves. Some famous people, like the cricket player Colin Cowdrey, were excused for health reasons, causing controversy. Elvis Presley had managed to delay his army service, and in January 1958, he started filming King Creole, his 4th movie. The film was based on a book by Harold Robbins called A Stone for Danny Fisher. The story was adapted to fit Elvis, turning Danny Fisher from a boxer into a singer, and moving the setting from New York to New Orleans. The director, Michael Curtiz, who had directed the classic Casablanca, gave the film a stylish noir feel. Elvis was excited about the role. He played Danny Fisher, a moody, rebellious singer who gets into trouble but ultimately finds his way. The film was shot in black and white, and many of the scenes were filmed on Bourbon Street, capturing the lively atmosphere of New Orleans. Elvis sang and performed with a blend of Dixieland jazz and rock and roll, which added to the film's unique vibe. The movie had a strong cast, including Walter Matthau, Vic Morrow, and Carolyn Jones. Elvis's girlfriend in the film, Nellie, was played by Dolores Hart, who later became a nun. The supporting cast was talented, but the girls Elvis played alongside in his films were often not the most appealing to the audience. The real draw was Elvis himself, and the girls in the audience came to see him. One of the highlights of the film was the song New Orleans, which had a bluesy feel. Another standout track was Trouble, a Leiber and Stoller composition that Elvis performed with intensity. The film also featured As Long as I Have You, Don't Ask Me Why, and Lover Doll, which showed Elvis's range as a performer. Elvis was so into the role that he felt it was his best part yet. He even kissed Sophia Loren on set, though they had never met before. Despite the film's quality, the title was changed several times. It was initially going to be Sing, You Sinners, or Danny, and a song called Danny was recorded but not used in the film. Later, it was released under the title Lonely Blue Boy, and became a hit for Conway Twitty. The soundtrack album was a hit, reaching No. 2 in the US and No. 1 in the UK. However, Elvis's miming in some of the film's musical sequences was less than perfect, which was a bit of a letdown. The single Hard-Headed Woman was a big hit, reaching No. 1 in the US, but it was almost banned by the BBC for making fun of biblical stories. Paul McCartney later criticized the song for its use of a trombone, but the track was still a fan favorite. Elvis's time making King Creole was a success, but it was a bittersweet period. He knew his army service was looming, and he was about to leave the stage and screen for a while. His fans were worried, but Elvis was determined to make the most of his time before he had to report for duty. While filming King Creole, Elvis released a couple of hit singles, including Don't and I Beg of You, both of which reached the top 10. Another single, Wear My Ring Around Your Neck, became a hit, and the B-side, Don't You Think It's Time, was also popular. These songs showed Elvis's range and his ability to connect with his audience. In March 1958, Elvis gave 2 final performances at Rosewood Park in Memphis. He threw a diamond ring into the crowd as he left the stage, and these were his last live shows for a few years. The stadium later burned down, and Elvis didn't perform live again until 1961. Elvis's fans were anxious about his upcoming Army service, and some even called the draft board to protest. Despite the concerns, Elvis would soon be headed to the military, but he had left a lasting impression with King Creole and his hit songs. His time in the Army would be a new chapter, but his fans would always remember his rebellious, charismatic performances on screen and stage. Elvis Presley reported for duty at the Memphis Draft Board on a chilly morning in late March 1958. He wasn't alone. His parents, girlfriend Anita Wood, manager Colonel Parker, and a few close friends were there to see him off. Fans and reporters swarmed around, capturing the moment. Elvis, always the showman, seemed almost casual, but inside he must have felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. After the initial formalities, Elvis and the other recruits were taken to the Kennedy Veterans Hospital for medical evaluation. The day was long, filled with tests and paperwork, but it was just the beginning. In the afternoon, they returned to the draft board for the induction ceremony. Elvis was put in charge of the other recruits, a role that suited his natural leadership. At 5 p.m. they set off for Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, a 6-hour journey away. The next morning, Elvis woke up at 5:30 a.m., ready for his new life. He faced a series of aptitude tests, and of course, a regulation haircut. But even with his new, shorter hair, Elvis still looked like a star. The tests went well, and he was assigned to drive tanks, a role he found exciting. Despite the military routine, Elvis's charm and charisma were impossible to hide. After a few days, Elvis and his fellow recruits were sent to Fort Hood, Texas, for basic training. The base was home to 23,000 soldiers, and it was a different world from the one Elvis was used to. The training was intense, with long marches and tough physical challenges. One night, a soldier joked about Elvis's teddy bear, but Elvis took it in stride. He was determined to prove himself. During his training, Elvis encountered a poisonous snake in his tent, a moment that could have been dangerous but became just another story. He also made a close friend, Rex Mansfield, who joined the Army on the same day. Together, they had some fun off base, including a visit to an air hostess training center. Elvis's basic training ended with a 2-week leave, and he planned to relax. However, he also agreed to 2 days of recording sessions with his friends. At RCA in Nashville, he recorded 5 songs, including hits like I Need Your Love Tonight and A Big Hunk O' Love. These recordings would keep his fan base engaged while he was away. While Elvis was away, there was an anti-Elvis backlash in Mexico. Rumors spread that he had made offensive remarks about Mexicans, which led to protests and the burning of his records. Despite this, Elvis remained a beloved figure to many, as evidenced by a survey where he was ranked 3rd in a list of admired people. Elvis's family moved to a town near Fort Hood, so he could see them more often. His mother, Gladys, became ill and was hospitalized. Elvis was devastated when she passed away, and he took a leave of absence to be with her. The loss was profound, and it affected him deeply. Colonel Parker, always the showman, turned the funeral into a spectacle, allowing hundreds of fans to pay their respects. After a brief period of mourning, Elvis was posted to West Germany. He took his father, grandmother, and a few friends with him, a move that was unusual but understandable given his fame. On the way, he gave interviews and even appeared in a newsreel, showing his wit and charm. In Germany, Elvis was stationed at Friedberg, about 20 miles north of Frankfurt. He was given a sleeping out pass, allowing him to return to his family's home in Bad Nauheim each evening. However, the attention he received soon became too much, and he was reassigned to a scouting platoon. His new role as a reconnaissance jeep driver kept him busy and away from the spotlight. One of the highlights of his time in Germany was meeting Bill Haley and his Comets. Elvis considered joining them on stage, but the police feared a riot. Despite the challenges, Elvis found ways to enjoy his time, including a brief romance with a young typist named Margaret Burgeon. Elvis's military service was a period of growth and change. He faced new challenges, made lasting friendships, and continued to make music. But the loss of his mother and the demands of fame took a toll. Yet through it all, Elvis remained the king, a symbol of rock and roll and a legend in his own time. Bobby Bare, a country singer, was drafted into the Army just like Elvis Presley. Before he left, Bobby wrote a song called All-American Boy, a playful take on Elvis' induction. But because Bobby was already in the Army, his friend Bill Parsons had to release the song under his own name. Bill ended up performing the song on American Bandstand, lip-syncing to Bobby's recording. Bobby hoped Bill would buy him a new car when he got out of the Army, but neither of them made much money from it. The song became a hit in the US, reaching number 2 on the charts, but it didn't do as well in the UK. Around the same time, Elvis was in Germany, and his parents Vernon and Gladys were involved in a car accident. Elvis, who was already paranoid, thought the accident was caused by sexual favors being given in the car. His relationship with Elizabeth, who was both his secretary and girlfriend, was complicated. She was German, and her stepfather was stationed at the same base as Elvis. According to Elizabeth, she would spend nights with Elvis, but he avoided full sexual contact to avoid paternity suits. When their relationship ended, Elvis' friend Rex Mansfield started dating Elizabeth and they got married. Elvis never spoke to them again. Elvis' father, Vernon, started a relationship with a woman named Dee Stanley, who was 10 years older than Elvis. Dee was divorcing her husband and showed interest in Elvis, but Elvis wasn't happy about it. Dee and Vernon started having a secret affair, and Elvis would pound on the piano in his room to drown out the noise. Eventually, Vernon was sent back to Memphis on business, but he returned soon after. In May 1959, a British singer named Terry Dean was drafted into the Army, but he broke down after just 2 days. This made Elvis' manager, Colonel Parker, issue a fake press release saying that Elvis was enjoying his time in the Army. Meanwhile, a British film called Idol on Parade made fun of a pop star in the Army, and the star, Anthony Newley, became a hit. Elvis was promoted to Specialist 4th Class in June 1959. He was still picking up girls and discarding them. One night, he tried to heat his tank during a training exercise, but ended up nearly killing himself with carbon monoxide. He was taken to the hospital, and the newspapers reported that he was too sick to speak. When Elvis was feeling better, he and some friends went to Paris for a 10-day trip. They visited nightclubs and had a lot of fun. Elvis even started karate lessons, but didn't visit any museums. He almost missed his deadline to return to his base, and had to hire an expensive car to get back on time. In Germany, Elvis had a hit with A Big Hunk o' Love, but it wasn't his best work. He also released an album called A Date with Elvis, which included some old recording. Elvis spent a lot of time recording himself on a tape recorder, working on gospel songs for a religious album. In August 1959, Captain Joseph Beaulieu and his family, including his stepdaughter Priscilla, arrived in Germany. Priscilla was only 14, but she was allowed to meet Elvis at night. Elvis was struck by her resemblance to his mother and himself. They started seeing each other regularly, and Elvis even bought a car for Captain Beaulieu. When Priscilla's schoolwork started to suffer, Elvis suggested she take Benzedrine, a stimulant. Hal Wallis, a film producer, visited Elvis to discuss his first post-Army movie, G.I. Blues. The movie would be loosely based on Elvis' Army life, but they would use a stand-in for location shots in Germany. Wallis also had plans for other movies, including a Western and a film about a Mississippi gambler. In November 1959, a man named Dr. Lawrence Landau, who wasn't a real doctor, told Elvis he could improve his skin with aromatherapy. Elvis started the treatment, but Landau was more interested in taking photos and recordings. Elvis eventually fired him for trying to feel his manhood. Landau returned and tried to blackmail Elvis with compromising photos and recordings. Elvis paid him off and reported the incident to the FBI, but the FBI decided not to take any action that would make Elvis look bad. Elvis' life in the Army was full of ups and downs. from his relationships to his music, and even his interactions with con men. Despite the challenges, he managed to stay in the public eye and maintain his popularity. Elvis Presley's life was a mix of fame, music, and relationships. His time in the Army and his connection with Priscilla Beaulieu are some of the most interesting parts of his story. When Elvis was in the Army, he met Priscilla, a young girl who was only 14 at the time. Despite the age difference, they started a relationship. Priscilla was drawn to Elvis's charm and fame, while Elvis found her innocent and sweet. He gave her a gold and diamond watch, and a ring inlaid with pearls and diamonds. In return, Priscilla gave him some bongo drums, which he said he loved, even though he might not have really meant it. Years later, Priscilla found several sets of bongos at Graceland, showing that Elvis kept them as a reminder of their early days. The winter of 1960 was particularly cold, and Elvis faked a high temperature to avoid military maneuvers. This showed that even the famous Elvis could be a bit of a trickster. He was never a five-star general, but he did become a buck sergeant commanding a small team. However, the military life wasn't for him, and he decided not to stay in the Army longer than he had to. By February 1960, Elvis and Priscilla were getting more serious. Priscilla, who was still very young, begged Elvis to take their relationship further, but he refused, saying she was too young. This shows that Elvis, despite his reputation, had a sense of right and wrong, especially when it came to Priscilla. When Elvis left Germany, he left behind many of his possessions, including a gospel LP he had marked with a warning to keep others from touching it. He also wrote a letter to a music publisher, expressing his frustration with the quality of the songs he was being offered. At a press conference, he talked about his 16-year-old girlfriend Priscilla, but he was careful not to reveal too much, knowing it could cause trouble. Elvis's return to the United States was a big event. He arrived at McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey during a snowstorm. The Army held a press conference, and he was surprised to see Marion Kasker, who had worked at Sun Records. He was discharged from the Army and quickly got back to his music career. He showed the press his final pay packet, which was only $109.54, and he looked much more muscular than when he had joined the Army. Elvis returned to Graceland and held another press conference. He visited the Stone Angels on his mother's grave, a deeply emotional moment for him. He then went to see the Holiday on Ice show and enjoyed it so much that he went to a performance for a predominantly African-American audience. Being Elvis, he was allowed to conduct the orchestra and even invited the entire cast to Graceland. Elvis's behavior in Germany was sometimes questionable, but it's important to remember the context of the time. The military seemed to turn a blind eye to a lot of things, and the press wasn't as intrusive as it is today. If the same story happened now, it would likely be a bigger scandal. When it comes to sex and relationships, Elvis was a complex figure. He was known for his charismatic stage presence and his ability to excite his audience with his movements. His relationships with women were often romantic and passionate, but he also had a reputation for being selective about when and with whom he became intimate. Priscilla, despite being much younger, was one of the few women he seemed to truly care about, and he respected her boundaries. Elvis's relationships with women, especially Priscilla, show a side of him that was more thoughtful and considerate than his public image might suggest. Even though he was a star, he had his own set of values and principles, which sometimes meant he held back, even when others might not have. Elvis Presley's life was a mix of highs and lows, and his relationship with Priscilla was just one part of his complex story. Despite the challenges, their relationship endured, and they eventually got married, with Priscilla remaining a virgin until their wedding day. This shows that Elvis, despite his reputation, had a deep sense of respect and honor, especially when it came to the women he truly cared about. The world of rock and roll has always been a place of rebellion and excitement, but it has also been a place where the boundaries of what is acceptable have been tested. Take Jerry Lee Lewis, for example. His wild performances and hit songs made him a star, but his personal life was a different story. In 1957, he married his 13-year-old cousin, Myra Brown. This caused a huge scandal, especially when he brought her to the UK for a tour. People were outraged, and his career suffered a major setback. But music has a way of healing, and Jerry Lee Lewis eventually made a comeback, then there's Chuck Berry. He was another rock and roll icon, known for his catchy tunes and energetic performances. But in 1959, he was arrested for taking a 14-year-old girl across state lines for immoral purposes. He ended up serving 3 years in prison. Despite this, when he was released, his popularity had only grown. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones were playing his songs, and he was back on top. These stories show that the music industry, especially in its early days, had a different set of rules. What was tolerated back then might not be acceptable today. Stars like Elvis Presley, who met Priscilla when she was just 14, and Roy Orbison, who sang about child women, were part of a culture that often blurred the lines between admiration and exploitation. But as time has passed, society has become more aware of the importance of protecting young people. The music and the memories of these artists remain, but the way we view their actions has changed. Today, we strive to create a world where young people are respected and safe, and where the lines between right and wrong are clearer. In the end, music is more than just the songs we hear. It reflects the times we live in, the good and the bad. It's a reminder of our past, a mirror to our present, and a guide to our future. As we continue to enjoy the classic tunes of rock and roll, it's important to also learn from the mistakes of the past and build a better, more compassionate world.